Do you know who Melville Fuller is? I bet you don't. So I'm going to tell you who he is. Melville Fuller was born on February 11th, 1833, in Augusta, Maine. His mom was Catherine Weston, and his father was Frederick A. Fuller. Fuller graduated from Bowdoin College in 1853, then continued his education at Harvard Law School. While Fuller was attending Harvard, he then got admitted to the bar in 1855. Just the following year, in 1856, Fuller moved to Chicago, where he began to practice law. In Chicago, Fuller served as Stephen Douglas's campaign manager during his presidential run against Abraham Lincoln in 1860. In 1861, Fuller was elected a Democrat to the Illinois Congressional Convention. Just a year later, in 1862, he was elected to the state House of Representatives, where he served one term. In 1888, Melville Fuller was appointed by President Grover Cleveland. At first, Cleveland appointed Fuller as the Solicitor General, but he then declined that offer. Cleveland then appointed him as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, in which he accepted on April 30th, 1888. The Senate confirmed this 3 months later. Fuller died in Sorrento, Maine on July 4th, 1910, at the age of 77. Fuller served 21 years as the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Some of Melville Fuller's most notable cases would be Plessy v. Ferguson and Lochner v. New York. Fuller had 2 children with Callista O. Reynolds. Their marriage ended when Callista died in 1864, and in 1866 Fuller remarried Mary Ellen Kohlberg and had 7 children with her.
Have you ever heard of the case called Brown versus the Board of Education? If you haven't, I'm about to tell you more about it in the coming slides. The main person who was involved in the Brown versus Board of Education case was Thurgood Marshall. Thurgood Marshall was the head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. He served as chief attorney for the plaintiffs. Years later, Thurgood Marshall actually was appointed as the first black Supreme Court justice. This case occurred in 1954. The case was a huge cornerstone for the civil rights movement because it helped establish the fact that separate but equal education was actually not equal at all. This case originated in Topeka, Kansas. Even though the name Brown v. Board of Education was the name given to 5 separate cases that were heard by the U.S. Supreme Court, they all concerned the same issue of segregation in public schools. In this case, the main issue was the constitutionality of state-sponsored segregation in public schools. Thurgood Marshall constantly raised the issue and stated that the separate school systems for blacks and whites were inherently unequal. He went on to say that they violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution. This case went to court because it violated the 14th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution. Not only did it violate the amendment, but the segregated school system had a tendency to make black children feel inferior to white children. At first, the justices were very divided on what to make on school segregation. The Chief Justice, who was Fred M. Vinson, wanted to hold the opinion that the Plessy verdict should stand. But before this case was heard, Vinson died and Earl Warren, who was the governor of California, replaced him. Earl Warren showed good skill and determination and made a unanimous verdict against school segregation the next year. Warren came up with the verdict that separate but equal has no place, as segregated schools are inherently equal. Brown versus the Board of Education started off as 5 cases. All the lower cases all ended in defeat. Over 1/3 of states segregated their schools by law, and Brown versus the Board of Education was a unanimous decision.